Good morning and welcome to Sibos Day 3, Transforming the Landscape. And we are going to kick off this morning with an exciting panel and a discussion on moving towards a single platform for all payments. I'm Lisa Lansdowne-Higgins. I'm actually with the Royal Bank of Canada. I have a role today that is the Vice President for Card Operations and Supplier Management. But throughout my career, I grew up in correspondent banking and looking at what all of the marketability and commercial aspects are around high value and low value, or what we now affectionately look to as real-time payments. I'm certainly joined this morning by a distinguished panel who are going to talk to many of the varying aspects across the different geographies with respect to real-time payments platform and what the dialogue and discussion will be. We know that pressures continue to mount and the demands from clients around real-time payments is ever mounting. And so each of us from a different country perspective are grappling with that. I do know even in the Canadian perspective, we continue to work through our modernization discussion and what will that ultimately look like. I'm actually going to turn it over to my panelists this morning to introduce themselves. And in introducing themselves, the first question that I am going to ask of them is, how do you define a single payments platform within your marketplace? And Mark, I'll pass to you first.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. I am Mark Bell from the European Central Bank. I am in charge of market infrastructure and payments, and in particular for Europe of Target 2. T2S, and our reflection on this question, very interesting question, whether we should go towards a single payment platform for Europe. We are thinking to revamp our Target 2 into a new payment platform, which would embrace services for all type of payment, real-time, instant, as you are saying. It is a challenge for all economic areas these days. I think what will be particularly interesting this morning to discuss with the colleagues is also the fact that we are within our area doing a lot of things to get payments through a single platform, but how this will interrelate with a different region in the world would be also very interesting to explore.
Good morning, Lisa. Tony Brady, I'm the head of global product management for BNY Mellon. I guess I'm probably a little bit of, I have a different perspective on the panel because, you know, I think that the word single platform is a little bit of a misnomer. It kind of implies that somehow we're going to create this, you know, single global software program that's going to enable, you know, global payments to be handled more efficiently. I actually think it has a lot more to do with a single global real-time payment experience. And I like to use a story related to the telecommunications industry to make my point. So, you know, I travel internationally a lot, and when I land in a foreign country and I turn on my phone, without even knowing the local telecommunications company, actually before, you know, the plane even stops on the runway, I'm now connected to a telecommunications company that I have no relationship with, and within seconds, I can call, text, or video virtually anyone in the world. Now compare that kind of experience to what we deliver with cross-border transactions. We can't tell, depending on the corridors, but in general, we can't tell our client how long it's going to take to get the payment there. We can't tell them how much it's going to cost end-to-end. We can't give them payment status information while the payment is in transit, and we can't tell them when the beneficiary receives the funds. When you compare it to what the telecommunications industry has done, I'm not proud of that experience. So when I think of a single global payment platform, what I'm really targeting is I want to provide our clients with a single global real-time payment experience so that they don't have to worry about how financial institutions and market infrastructures in the background are making that experience happen.
And Miguel?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Miguel Diaz. I'm Director of Payment Systems at Banco de Mexico. I want to share with you a little bit the vision of Banco de Mexico regarding how financial market infrastructure should work. Basically, our vision is that what is important about financial market infrastructures is that they have to be transparent, both from a perspective of the cost and from the perspective of the operations. So in line with what Tony just said, we believe that it is very important for the customer, for the final recipient of the services, not to take a lot into account in terms of what is going to happen with the financial market infrastructure, and actually dedicate all the efforts in terms of the economic decision-making that is underlying the transactions that go in financial market infrastructures. So in this sense, I think the challenge that we all have in the payments area is to allow every participant to exploit the network externalities of the different markets that we have in financial market infrastructures. And how we do this, we can do it on two ways. We can do it by having a single language, which everyone has to learn or relearn, or we can have translation, very efficient translation. Of course, there is a continuum between these two extreme scenarios. And I think which point in that continuum should be chosen depends on the cost structures of the particular country or market, how well it functions to begin with, and how the standards are in terms of the flexibility that they would allow for innovation to occur in a given market. So I think that the decision boils down basically to how big are the fixed costs of moving to a single language or to a single platform against the costs of paying a marginally higher fee for every transaction that is sent and having this a little bit more inefficient system with the translation in there. So the experience in Mexico is very particular. So we have a core payment system, which is called SPAY, to which all the banks are connected, and for which we have some non-banks also connected to that system, and we allow for real-time payments in that system. And this was possible in Mexico because we had a kind of an inefficient system before that. So it was a common sense decision for the banks to join SPAY and to start functioning through SPAY. But it is not a single platform in terms that we have the same language for everyone. So of course, everyone that participates in SPAY speaks the language of SPAY, has a very simple message that they use to communicate through SPAY, but also SPAY communicates with other financial market infrastructures, both domestically and internationally. And for that, we use translation. So that is the balance that has been reached in Mexico, and it is not one of the two corners. It is actually right in the middle, where some of the transactions are spoken within in a single language, but then there is also a lot of translation going on for the financial market infrastructures to join in one.
Well, thank you for that. And last, Andrew.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Hauser. I'm Executive Director for Banking, Payments and Financial Resilience at the Bank of England, which amongst other things means I run our high-value payment system, or rather more specifically our RTGS infrastructure. When I hear the word platform, I think of trains, old-fashioned British view. And those of you who know London, if you want to travel north of London, you've got a choice of 3 stations within about 500 metres of each other: Euston, King's Cross and St Pancras. Each of them service roughly the same stations north of London. In fact, one station, Newark, has trains going to it from all 3. You would never design a system like that from scratch. The reason it's there is that historians of British trains will know is that in the 19th century there were competing train services, and they all built their own stations, and they all tried to differentiate themselves from one another and had different fees and different speeds and all the rest of it. 100, 200 years later, we still have those 3 stations. The service that those 3 stations offer is frankly very, very similar, but they're still there. 100 million passengers a year go through those 3 stations, divided very roughly a third in each place. So start from scratch, you'd never have that, but we work it and it works well and business is booming. There's a very strong comparison between those trains and the setup for payments in the UK in that respect. I counted about 15 different ways you can make a payment in the UK. You can get cash from us, the Bank of England. You can get it out of an ATM system called Link. You can make a faster payment. Obviously, we've had faster payments in retail space in the UK for about a decade. On a retail side, you can make a batch payment through something called BACS. You can make wholesale payments through CHAPS. You can make overseas payments through correspondent banks. You can use CLS for foreign exchange. And I could go on and on and on. And in some sense, those remind me of those 3 stations. The underlying service of the exchange of value is very, very similar. But each of the individual services is fine-tuned to the particular customer demand that has grown up, but is also very heavily shaped by the historic demand for those services. Now, in some sense, you may say, well, they're all dealing with their own customer base. That's great, but there are some problems. I think there are three problems in particular with having such a balkanized setup. Firstly, there's obviously a lot of direct costs. Each of them have a different rule book, different technology, different fee structure, different oversight regimes in some respect. Secondly, those same costs can establish barriers to entry for new players, and that's a big debate, I think, amongst all of us, particularly in the UK, looking at how to provide a holistic payment service across all those 10 or 15 systems involves a great deal of work just understanding how to connect. And thirdly, there's an interesting aspect from a central banking perspective of resilience. So in some ways, having the 3 train stations is great, because if King's Cross has a fire, you go to St Pancras. If it's and so in one sense. But of course, if you go to St Pancras and it doesn't take you to the right station, that doesn't seem such a great outcome. So the potential benefits of a widespread number of payment systems from a resilience perspective doesn't always happen in practice. What are we doing in the UK about it? Well, for reasons that I think have more to do with luck than necessarily good design, there is a fundamental reform going on both on the wholesale and the retail side. The wholesale part of it is my responsibility, the Bank of England's responsibility, and we've just announced a consultation on the future direction of our real-time gross settlement system, issued a consultation paper, and we've been out asking what people want to see. It's 20 years old, the system, it needs a refresh, a technology refresh. We've been out asking what people want to see from it. And they told us a few things. They said, well, look, firstly, the risk mitigation characteristics of RTS are actually very well thought of, and they want to see it. They'd like to see a better technology platform underpinning it, and they'd like 4 other things as well. They'd like better access, easier access for a wider range of entities. We have a highly tiered structure in the UK where the large banks are direct members. Most of the smaller and medium-sized banks are indirect members. That presents, I think, some challenges in the current climate. We also have announced that we intend to allow non-bank payment service providers to have access. This has caused some ripples amongst the central banking community because it breaches a bit of a theological divide. But it's important for us to send a signal that we recognise that some, at least, of the payment structures of the future will be run by non-banks. That's on access. We want it to be more interoperable, so we're going to embrace ISO 20022. We're going to make it potentially able to run 24/7. We want to make it more resilient. Obviously, the cyber threat is preoccupying all of us. And we want to provide better user functionality. That's on the wholesale side. And on the retail side, independently, the UK authorities set up a payment strategy forum designed to look at the future of retail systems. And I think what's the debate there, and it echoes very strongly what's happening in other jurisdictions, is whether these plethora of retail schemes should move to a world where there's still that differentiation feeding customer demand, but there are overlay services on a common pipe or a common underlying messaging pipe that sends these basic payment services. How much am I paying to whom, from whom, along a common pipe, and then the overlay services can provide different customer services to it. So that debate is ongoing as well. So a lot of change in the UK at the moment.
Well, I think first you touched on so many aspects within that. One of the key things that I'm going to hone in on for all of the panelists is around business case. So what are the actual underpinning driving factors that are having us consider what we need to do from a single payments platform and how we're going to move forward? I know you touched on a couple of them, certainly costs, but also, and as well, Miguel, I think you touched on, what will the cost of the infrastructure be as well? So, Mark, did you want to take that first?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Indeed, the driver to consider the revamping or the refreshing of our technology in the field of payment are basically following two key objectives. So the first one is efficiency, cost efficiency, but also technical efficiencies, I think. So gaining, more efficient technologies, being with capacities to be instant, to bring the layer mentioned by Andrew, that we have this at least settlement base where we have key factors we can really use and capitalize on, using technologies which are across the different families of payment that we have to process, using ISO 20022 technology. And the second axis, which is very important for Europe these days, but I guess it's the same challenge globally, is to support innovation. So a lot of things are happening on the innovation side. We speak a lot of the fintechs, of the use of new technologies like distributed ledger technologies. And while I'm not sure those technologies are really fit for purpose for our payment infrastructure, they certainly need to have infrastructure which can help financial innovation to work properly in our area. And so for Europe, that's basically the trends we take. In this respect, last week, the Governing Council of the European Central Bank decided to launch 3 investigations to see how to modernize our payment infrastructure at large. One being the refreshing of Target 2, moving to new technology, to new messaging, ISO 20022 for payments, and to see what type of additional services we can bring to the market to be more efficient. And it's very interesting to hear what Miguel is saying, because indeed the interconnectivity between different areas and different regions of the world will be one of the challenges also that we'll have to discuss in this regard. Another one is to see how much we can increase our capacity to settle instantly. Today we are settling instantly, but just during, I would say, business hours. So how much we need to extend this, and again, it's a technological challenge more than anything, is to be able to have a technology so 24/7, 365 for settlement purpose, so not entering into new functionality, but really the basic settlement services. And the last one, which is important, and that we should not forget, is that the world in which we are is about liquidity management. So the management of collateral also is very important. The particularity of Europe is fragmentation by nature, because we are building it on the existing countries. We have to be able to use better our collateral to generate the sufficient liquidity where you need it. A big step forward has been made in Europe by the T2S, which is bringing the settlement of securities transaction, DVP central bank money into one place. So it's a big step forward. We are almost there. As you know, we just migrated the third wave of CSDs together with France, Netherlands, and Denmark. Next to come, and rest of Belgium, sorry. And rest to come is Germany, Spain, Finland, and some others, which will join the platform soon. So we will be there on the cash leg with Target 2, on the securities leg with T2S. Now collateral, how efficient we can be in managing collateral for our purpose as a central bank will be the next challenge. And the connection between the three will make the single platform concept, even though it's based on different technique platform, work better. So I look at it pretty much like Tony was saying, that the main point is really how much you can interconnect properly this to know exactly at which point you can use your collateral, your cash capacity, or your payments, and know where and how to manage in the most efficient way those.
Yeah, I think really what's interesting on that is that extension of the definition of payments as well, in the sense of looking at it cross-spectrum into other areas, like your T2S and your refresh from a securities perspective. So what is it in best practices as you look at a single platform or that definition of modernization, and how you can further extend that into other businesses, which then helps from a liquidity perspective? Miguel, you talked a little bit about your environment. I'm wondering, you touched a little bit on the benefits and what were the driving factors, but can you expand a little bit more on what drove some of the decisions?
Of course. So, as I said in my previous comment, we're interested in economic activity and economic decisions being taken or being made without having to take into account what is going on with the payment that actually fulfills that economic activity. So in that sense, economic activity is going on 24/7, and economic activity is happening between people that have accounts with different banks and probably with assets that are located at different financial market infrastructures. So we, in terms of fulfilling this vision, we have to have a system that can communicate overall, that can communicate 24/7, and that can allow for people to fulfill their transactions or whenever they want, wherever they want, and with whoever they want. So in this sense, the SPAY has worked towards that goal. Last year, we started operating SPAY in a 21/7 schedule for small value payments. And this year, on March, we started operating SPAY in a 24/7 for mobile payments. So this implies real and really significant challenges in terms of how you provide this without having a timeout, how you provide this in terms of liquidity, how you get this done. And as Tony said, or as Tony has mentioned, it is important for us to do all the job so that the consumers and the final users of the financial market infrastructures do not notice what is going on behind the curtain. So we have to provide a service that is very simple for the people to use, very cheap for the people to use, and we have to do all the job behind the curtain. Mm-hmm. So that is what we are doing in Mexico. We're trying to do, and we're trying to connect ever more financial market infrastructures. We're trying to connect the card system with the RTGS. We're trying to connect the SSS with the RTGS. So we're trying to make this vision, to fulfill this vision of having really the economic decisions in the forefront and having just the FMIs and the financial transactions on the background without people having to take care of what it is that is being done to settle the financial obligations. So we have to send it to the background. We have to make it be a commodity which is not relevant in the decision-making process.
Excellent. And Tony, any thoughts from a business case perspective that are driving the conversation in your market?
Yeah, so in the U.S., BNY Mellon views a number of initiatives as critical to creating the kind of global real-time experience that I spoke about. I would say the first is Swift GPI, and there's been a lot of talk about GPI at Sibos already. We view that as very positive. We're one of the banks who are helping to determine the product roadmap for GPI. When you think about the challenges that we as an industry have had with cross-border payments for decades, GPI goes an awful long way to addressing the speed, the cost, and the lack of transparency related to cross-border payments. So we're very much very bullish about GPI and where that's going. And from a business case perspective, you can look at this in two ways. You can ask yourself, okay, what are the financial implications on each bank in our industry? But you can also look at business case from the perspective of what happens if we don't invest. And to some degree, I think GPI is a good example where the banks, 86 of us now, at least as of Sunday, 86 of us are looking at that from both sides and saying we cannot afford not to invest. But on the other hand, as we've started to build out the GPI roadmap, we realized that there are tremendous benefits from some of the products we're going to launch. A good example is the payment tracker that tracks end-to-end the status of a payment from originator to beneficiary. When you look at what's happening in the back offices of global banks, 70% of the inquiries we get about cross-border transactions come down to two things. Where's my payment? And the beneficiary is claiming non-receipt. Both of those issues go away with the implementation of the payment tracker. So what happens in our industry when we can take 70% of the inquiries out of our back office? Not only are we providing a better service, but we can lower our cost. The other thing that's very active in the U.S. is real-time payments. So we're building out the real-time payments initiative with the help of the clearinghouse. From a business case perspective, it's interesting. We believe that we're going to be able to pull a fair amount of transactions out of cash. So that's going to help us also reduce cost. But the price point for real-time payments is also still very reasonable, but it's higher than ACH. So are we doing this purely to generate revenue? Absolutely not. We're doing it to be more competitive. But there also will be financial benefits and rewards for those participating.
You know, it's really interesting, and when I listened to Miguel, your discussion on moving to a 24/7 and the challenges that you faced, but also aligning that back in, Tony, in principle, into the costs and how it is that we need to marry the two. There's so many synergies in there. I know I was listening to the McKinsey report yesterday, and in line with that, they had actually said, looking forward from a cost perspective around payments, especially in the correspondent banking world, we need to be able to drive down costs in the future by at least 90%. So hearing those factors and those statistics really does help to reinforce. Andrew, any thoughts that you wanted to add into that from your opening as well?
I think we've done it already. the number of pressures for change is huge, right? I mean, whether it comes from consumer demand, company demand, whether it comes from cost pressures, whether it comes from the technology that allows you to do new things, the regulation that requires people to get liquidity into single pools, the cyber threats, all those things are actually pushing in the same direction towards convergence. I think an interesting question about payments, and lots of industries are going through this, is how responsive has payments been over time? Will it be over time to those enormous economic challenges? You might well think, why are we even sitting here discussing it rather than getting on and doing it? And I think, in some sense, it's good we're having that conversation, but it's probably, not too soon. Let me just put it as gently as that. I think when you talk about business cases, often central banks are accused of not taking that very seriously. We have two main concerns, I think, in terms of building our own system for the higher value payments. We want to make sure that as many payments as possible are done in central bank money. That gives you finality. That gives you that removes settlement risk. And we want to we want to maximize operational resilience in the system. Both of those things have become more important over time. And you might say, well, look, so long as we establish that stability, well, innovation and enabling business and so forth has to come second and perhaps last. I think what we're learning is those two are not contradictory. They actually reinforce one another. And one of the things that we heard when we were out consulting on what the future shape of our RTGS platform should be is, look, if you want to maintain a large share of payments being in central bank money, you've got to change, you've got to innovate, because the risk for you as a central bank is that as people design these new systems, these new seamless systems with new technologies, they may not take place in central bank money. It's not guaranteed, and something we've worked for decades to try and deliver could go into reverse, and people call it, sort of Ubering of central banks. We have to be very alert to that, or we'll have a reversal in some of the changes we've made. If we don't innovate, we will impede innovation elsewhere. And, for a while, I think people think, well, innovation possibly at the margin, if it means adding crazy things to the system, might impede stability. Well, that's possible. But I think innovation more commonly can help you improve stability. I mean, how stable is it if you have ancient legacy systems, puffing steam out of the broken pipes? How stable is that? The innovation, when it means providing more robust, more modern systems attached to your payment system, is a good thing for stability as well. It reinforces it. And so as we thought about what does the new generation of RTGS need to do, we thought, well, it does need to understand that the future outside of RTGS is changing. It needs to be able to communicate to it. It needs to be able to adopt those technologies where they're mature enough.
And so from a technology perspective and a new entrant, seeing as how you've touched on that, is there anything specific as you're looking at your consultation papers and reviewing that, that you would anchor into what you see coming through for a payments platform?
Well, it wouldn't be, I saw some Twitter discussion where they were playing a bingo game as to how many buzzwords would be used on particular Sibos panels. I think the Internet of Things was up to 390 in a single panel. Machine learning and AI was up there as well. So let me say distributed ledger, and someone out there will get a full house and a special prize. But look, we're all interested in distributed ledger. We at Bank of England and other central banks as well have rolled our sleeves up and got interested in the technology. It's much better, I would recommend, to get on with it and have a look at it than it is just to listen to other people doing it. It teaches you two things. One is a bunch of the things you hear about it that aren't mature enough yet are true. Scalability, privacy and confidentiality, and resilience are all things that need further work. And so, as I think Mark already said, we're not convinced that it's ready to be used for the core of our own system. But look, this system that we'll build will be in place for 5, 10, 15 years. There's no doubt, is there, that the world outside of the central bank will be using these technologies. So we need to understand how to speak to them. We need to understand the new types of entity that will want to attach to central bank money. And as I say again, it links back to the old central bank objectives of making sure that things happen in central bank money. We could ignore it. We could say it's not going to happen. But it'll develop anyway, and it'll develop in a less safe way. So opening up in a controlled and safe way to these new technologies, whilst keeping an eye on them for our own systems and being ready to adopt them when they're ready, is the balance we're trying to strike.
All right, and I think that's really important as you do look forward, especially when you look at stability and transparency and risk. And Mark, were there any thoughts that you wanted to add from a technology perspective?
I think I cannot add much more to what Andrew said. I really share his point. I think our role as central banks is to provide a resilient, safe, and efficient infrastructure which are supporting the development of the economies where we are working. So for us, it's euro in Europe. And we certainly have to understand those new developments, the fintechs, not only distributed ledger technology, so it helps for the Twitter, but also we have to understand all those developments and to favor innovation in our economic area. It does not have just to come from a single place, not to name it in particular, but we really need to make our economies welcoming those new developments so that we can really see it as it goes. By the way, globalization is a similar challenge in a certain way, not technological, but the fact that there is more and more interaction between different regions of the world and that this is happening and how much our infrastructures are able to support these developments also is a very important question, I think. But maybe we tackle it later, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely when we circle back on risk. But, Miguel, from a technology perspective, what have you seen given where your marketplace is with the infrastructure?
So one significant challenge, I think the most significant challenge in terms of IT is how you keep the system going 24/7 and with 5 nines, right? So that is a really, really hard challenge for us to provide this core infrastructure. And particularly, this is really important because for the case of Mexico, our RTGS SPAY actually is the underlying pipe through which most of the financial transactions transit in the country. So having this if you want, single platform does not only allow for the efficiency of the payments flow, but also implies very important risks. If you face a problem with that underlying tubes, if you face a problem with it, then you face a problem with all your economic activity in the country. So we have to be really careful on what we do in terms of cybersecurity, on what we do in terms of cyber resilience. We have to invest a lot of money in terms of facing the new challenges, facing the new threats that are there, especially because when you concentrate or when you allow everything to pass through the same tube, this tube becomes very, very important from the perspective of ill-intentioned individuals. So if you want to commit fraud, if you want to commit if you want to disrupt the payment system, if you want to disrupt the economy, you're always going to try and tackle that single infrastructure, that single platform. So it is very, very important to keep this in mind and to keep this in the investment decisions that you have to do on these single platforms.
Before we dive into risks and challenges, and I think you'll hear much of that as echoed across the panel, I didn't want to neglect Tony from a technology and an innovation perspective. And Miguel, the one thing I'll say as an ops person at the moment in my career, it always warms my heart to see that we can take technology and that type of design into looking at operational efficiency and new solutions that can come into the back office as well. So generally they can be the last ones thought of, but it's nice to see that they're on the agenda in the consideration right up front. But Tony, your thoughts?
Yeah, so from a bank perspective, I can only speak for BNY Mellon, but I think I have a lot of company here. I mean, with limited resources, you can only chase so many things. And so we know that we have to be very engaged with fintechs and be open to new technologies. And so, like many institutions, we've been experimenting with distributed ledger, trying to figure out what's going to work, what's not going to work. Some of you may have seen an announcement that we made in cooperation with some others about a utility settlement coin project that's starting up. So we're active in that space, but at the same time, we have plenty of other opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, whether real-time payments or GPI, to really move the industry forward to this global real-time payment experience that we believe in. So in a white paper that we just released a couple of days ago, we made public some internal criteria that we've been using to help guide our own thinking about how to spend our time, because there are too many options to choose from. And we settled on 3 markers of success that we look for to help us prioritize our initiatives. The first is standards, right? In our industry, if you don't have standards, you're going to end up with small, closed groups cooperating with one another, but it'll be difficult to scale. Standards lead to network effect, right? Network effect allows a critical mass of transactions to occur between all of us financial institutions, and we collectively serve our clients better. And the third is regulatory engagement, right? No matter what we do, ultimately we've got to get the regulators comfortable with it. And so we think the path to that is bringing the regulators in early. So we tend to use those three things to help us decide where to spend our time. And when you look at the spectrum of initiatives that are out there, the whole way from real-time payments, which are already being developed in some 40 nations already, the whole way through DLT, they all score a bit differently on those three markers of success, but that's how we think about it and decide how we're going to allocate our time.
Lisa, let me ask you a question. Have you heard of something called a chaos monkey?
I have not.
I think I might get a special bingo prize for that one. So and it picks on something Miguel said about this 5 nines idea, or 5 sigma, as our governor likes to call it. I mean, payments have to be incredibly robust. So people, the chaos monkey is a Netflix concept, as I understand it, or some of the audience may know better than that, but certainly Netflix use it. What it is a bit of code that Netflix let loose on their system, which deliberately tries to break it. Right? So it goes, and then Netflix is a distributed system as I understand it, and it goes around the system turning off switches at random. And the point of it is that they tell all their coders, when you code new bits of technology, you should do so in knowledge that the chaos monkey is out there trying to wreck your system. So everything you write has to be fault tolerant to a high degree. Even so, if we see a video and there's a bit of noise on, 20 minutes in, or there's a missing frame, we'll live with it, And if we have a phone call and it briefly drops out, we'll cope with that. Payments can't be like that, right? I mean, it can't be, I know you made a payment to your grandmother, but it didn't get there. Never mind, it'll be better next time. The chaos monkey got it. We have to be 100%, and that characterizes a lot of our thinking about technology. And it's interesting you compare this Sibos to a year ago when we were talking about building new infrastructure and all the positives of new technology, which remain true. This Sibos is much more reminding ourselves about the potential threats that come from technology as well. And so I think there is a lesson from that chaos monkey concept, which is that we should internalize the idea that there will always be something out there trying to turn the system off. It's pretty brave, right? And this is an interesting question whether it has a kind of recall message on it. The chaos monkey's gone rogue in my system and turning everything off. But can we think about that idea? Certainly in terms of automated testing, in terms of other concepts for our system, we do a lot of things manually. We do it very, very well. Quite often when some of the new technology companies come in and look at our performance standards, they're a little bit taken aback. They often don't admit it right up there, but then they go away. You can see them going, I do that? Well, it's been on all that time and it's never had these issues. And those standards are, it's not saying that they're unique in technology, but they are unusually high. And we have to remember that as we design our technologies to make sure that we can deliver that, because, we've had an experience in the UK in the last few years of quite a serious outage in our system. People are absolutely reliant on us for stability. We can do all the other things. We can do all the clever overlays and everything else. But if we muck up on stability, then we're in trouble.
I would agree completely on that. When you think of, although the chaos monkey, I've heard it in different forms, and that's really about stress testing the systems on how you can look to not necessarily break them, but where are your vulnerabilities in that. So I've heard it in a different way. My son will tell me that I'm certainly old school, so the Netflix chaos monkey will be something maybe he's...
Yeah, you got one up on him now.
I do, and I'm going to go home and make sure that I can take advantage of that. What's interesting is that we've set that bar in expectation, but it becomes commonplace, where our customer base, it just is natural to expect that we have that high sense of resiliency, availability, and ultimately the guarantee, to a certain extent, of the funds transmitting and being able to affect it. When you think of resiliency, though, and risks, I didn't want to lose track of that. Andrew, is there anything that you wanted to look at from that perspective?
I think one interesting question coming back to this balkanized environment we have in the UK is, and this is where the distributed ledger comes in, or at least the concept. What you really want with a payment is, right, it tries to go this way and it gets to a node and the node's out, and Chaos Monkey, whatever, has turned it off. You don't want the payment to go, oh, well, forget it, that's it, finish. You just want it to move and go somewhere else. And we're behind, I think, in payments in thinking about, as a system level, how to ensure that we are robust to nodal failures. Most of our payment systems, for the reasons we've described in terms of stability, are highly reliant on hub and spoke models. But that is the big, not to look sort of wide-eyed about distributed ledger, that from a central banking perspective, I think, is the real potential attraction, is that one of resilience. Now, the problem with resilience is effectively what the ledger says is, well, look, we'll take lots of copies of the ledger and we'll put it out everywhere. So if the Bank of England goes down, well, Deutsche Bank will have the ledger and it can just trade on. Well, that's great so long as Deutsche Bank's ledger, perhaps I shouldn't use an individual bank, but Bank X's ledger is secure. And the conversation we've had with a lot of the technology companies is don't just show us your security is good, prove it. And of course, that is a very hard question to answer. How many different types of way can you try and attack this and assure us it's secure? But I think the underlying thought that you want a system that's robust to nodal failure is a very, very important challenge for central bankers. If you think about the challenge of the 80s and 90s about removing settlement risk, a challenge that we have, I wouldn't say wholly met, but we have got a long way towards. I think the challenge of the next 10 or 20 years for us is to deliver, as people look for real-time payments, right? You're no longer tolerant of a 2-minute outage or a 2-day outage. You need it now. You're standing in front of a queue in a shop and you're paying and it says, well, sorry, could you come back in an hour? That's not the service you've been offered anymore. So you've had this unfortunate double coincidence of both people expecting much higher standard levels, but also the threat environment having gone up as well.
And what's interesting, too, is that if we consider going to a single platform, with all of those things that we just discussed, is there any increased risk in that, and how might we attack that from a barriers perspective?
The point is cyber resilience, cyber threats, anyway, is a topic where you need to work on permanently. So whether you have a distributed technology or centralized technology does not make the difference, that you have to be aware. So you have to know what is ongoing and to think how to strengthen your defense. So it's more, I would say, an attitude or a policy way to work out both from an operational side, but also from an oversight side for central banks to think about it. So for instance, on the oversight dimension, the ECB, together with other central banks, including Bank of England, published recently in a CPM IOSCO report guidance to look at resilience and cyber resilience in particular, which call for us as operator of system and also for all FMIs to look at, again, how much resilient is their platform. So it's not simply a single platform, a centralized technology or decentralized technology or multiple platform. Anyway, you are vulnerable. If you look at the Central Bank of Bangladesh case, that everyone is commenting here, even though there is a centralized function, Fedwire, in the end it was on the decentralized network that the weaknesses were spotted. So you will anyway not go around the question that whatever technology you take, you need to look at those questions of resilience. So now, whether it's easier to defend if you are more in a single environment, even though single platform is a very complex terminology, as we have seen, we can have different vision of it or different definition. The challenge will remain that you have to be careful and to look at your cyber context specifically, I think, and non-stop. It's not a one-off thinking and then you can rest for 10 years. It's a permanent thinking, I think. So we are in a new concept. Everything is going fast, as Andrew is saying. We cannot accept to discover that I am off for 2 days because there is a new threat who came in and blocked my platform.
And Miguel, any thoughts from your experience on that?
Yes, there is... I think that one very interesting point regarding cybersecurity is how we have been changing, at least from a central bank perspective, on how we manage cybersecurity. So a few years ago, what we were mainly focusing on is that our core systems were working properly and they don't have, or they're secure from a cyber attack perspective. Now we start finding out that it is not only necessary to take care of that core, but we have to take care of all the links of the chain of payments. So it is not sufficient to take care of your core system. You also have to take care that all the participants that connect to your system are also secure. And this is exactly going back to the Bangladesh case, in which the central core was perfectly fine, but the satellites that were connecting to the system were infiltrated, and the cyber threat came into the system through there. So from a central bank perspective, and actually from an operator perspective of a payment system, now it has become much more relevant to look at the whole ecosystem, every link in the chain, because where will the cyber criminals attack? They will attack the weakest link. And the weakest link is not necessarily the core. You also have to take care of everything that is around it. So I think that is a change that has been going on in the recent years, and we have started to pay much more attention to what is going on through the complete chain and not just on the central part of it.
Miguel, when we have the debate internally about, should we have more or fewer payments on our own balance sheet, does it worry you as the central bank that you have you're great if it all works, but if it doesn't all work, people are saying there's a central bank of Mexico's problem that I can't pay in the coffee shop or I can't pay in the hairdressers?
Yeah, so people actually take that view. And some banks that connect to our system, sometimes they fail and they
blame you.
And they blame the
right.
central part. So that is
we
why
all recognize that.
That's why we have to have a very, very, very sturdy system. So whenever these things happen, you have to be able to come out and say, you know what, we have 5 nines. And it was not a problem in terms of the central infrastructure. So having very clear views or having transparency on what is going on in the systems, I think it is very relevant, both from a reputational perspective and from the customer service perspective. No?
And before we turn it over to questions for the audience, Tony, any final thoughts around risk and some of the challenges around a single payment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with my colleagues, and there's certainly no shortage of risk. But keeping in mind that, I'm coming at it from the perspective not from a single global platform, but more a single global experience. I think certainly one of the risks that we haven't mentioned is, this is all about moving funds more quickly. And so one of the things that certain segments within financial services are actually pretty good at, but we've not really employed so much in the cross-border payment space, is real-time fraud analysis. So you've got to be able to monitor transactions going through the engine, right? They're going to happen much more quickly. So actually the credit card industry is pretty good at this, but cross-border, not so much. So that's an area I think where we've got to really focus on. A second that I would offer is the global regulatory environment. I mean, as a bank, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had some level of harmonization across all the various regions of the world? We're trying to stitch together that global payment experience, and I think more recent events would suggest that the global regulatory environment is kind of going in the other direction. It's more splintering than it is coming together. But actually, the risk that I worry about the most is complacency. Because as a financial institution community, sometimes we get a little complacent. And in this particular case, I think we need to keep our foot on the accelerator. I think the time is now to change. I think we've built appropriate level of momentum. I really don't want to see us let up, because I'm very concerned about what will happen to the cross-border payment industry if we do let up. So I'm pressing, and my colleagues are pressing. Particularly the GPI banks are pressing, not to let complacency creep back into what we're doing. Keep the foot on the accelerator. Continue to build on the momentum that we have.
Lisa, one thing we haven't talked about is who pays. Maybe that was going to be one of your questions, so I'll steal that one. But it's interesting that as we move towards these more joined-up platforms, I mean, there's 3 central banks here and 1 non-central bank. The problem of who coughs up is increasingly profound. Each individual private bank may well understand the business case, but clearly can't make the whole investment. that's often a license to delay. And so like when I said, why sometimes I think payments comes late to the game of some of these innovations, it has some really big sort of what you might call tragedy of the commons issues, that everyone is looking at everyone else. Are you going to step forward? Am I going to step forward? I don't really want to build this network for everyone else just to come in on it. Now, that often means that the central authority has at the very least to act as a coordinator, perhaps increasingly as a builder as well. I always sort of challenge the industry as to whether that's something they necessarily want, right? I mean, I'm sure we're great at building these things, and I'm sure we care a lot about some of the things that, stability and so forth we talked about this morning. I think from a purely pro-innovation and pro-competition perspective, it's rarely the case, actually, that the public sector getting involved in the design and build of every element of a system is first best. And I think industries, nationally, internationally, I think they all face that common challenge of how are we going to get around a table when we're mostly competing against each other and understand what our common interests are and then pay up. At a time when, let's face it, and most of the big banking organizations outside this room are worrying how to make money at all, let alone how to invest for the future.
Well, I'll tell you one community who's willing to pay for this, and that's the venture capital community.
Right.
And so, as financial institutions, I think we have to ask ourselves the same question that, I mentioned earlier, the telecommunications companies must have asked themselves, who do we want to deliver that experience to our clients? And so if the global financial, global transaction banks, whatever you want to call us, if we want to continue to own the cross-border payments industry, then we need to pay. And I believe that ultimately there are ways, as I said earlier, reducing costs that will help. But I also think that Swift GPI provides some reward in a sense, because the GPI banks are going to provide a higher level of service to clients. Ultimately, those banks may capture a higher share of the cross-border payment transactions that will also, in some sense, help us pay. But I look at this at some, kind of fundamental degree as survival. And I think that's also the way Swift looked at it when they looked at what was going on in the global transaction space and said, listening to the banks that they serve, this is something that we need to do.
Yeah, there's so many market pressures that are happening today, and I've been talking about that for a number of years, about the convergence of payments. And having myself grown up in correspondent banking, what we started to see was that although it had been the very traditional model of a top-down approach in development and where you were looking at product development, the convergence of real-time telecommunications and all of those advents of pressures coming into the real-time platform has almost turned it on its head, so that we're actually looking at consumer demands that are now driving innovative ideas and pushing that thought process that we were once complacent. What do we need to do? And I do think that the markets are absolutely reacting. When I look at all the consultation papers and I look at the outputs that are coming through, including in my own market, it's really testing those waters and pushing us beyond where it is that we would have a traditional mindset to think differently, whether it's telecommunications or fintechs, other industries. I mean, those have been practices that we've been doing for a very long time in the financial communities. As an ops person, Lean 6 was an adoption in from a completely different industry. So when I look at that convergence and what is happening today, it's why the agenda is being pushed, why 724 really becomes important. We have a few minutes left for questions from the audience, so I'd like to turn it over to the audience if you actually have a question. So I think there's one there in the back, and then we'll come up front to the front. So first back in the back of the audience.
Hi, John Baskerville, Payments Compliance. Andrew mentioned earlier about the initiative to open up settlement accounts to non-bank payment service providers, and that kind of causing ripples in the central banking communities. Is that an initiative that you see kind of being mimicked in other areas, or maybe in a kind of cross-border context? And if so, where does that leave the industry? That seems like quite a fundamental shift. Well,
I'll leave other central banks to speak for themselves. We're not the first, actually. The Australians, I think, opened up some years ago. The challenge for central banks, I think, in this area is to ensure that we are not taking in risks we don't understand into the system. And so what we have said is we are open to non-bank payment service providers getting accounts with us, but there'll be a quid pro quo. We're not going to dilute our standards of stability in order to allow that extra innovation and competition, and we're working with our regulators at the moment to make sure that there's a new regime in place to do it. It does raise some quite profound questions about the nature of money and about the nature, what the role of a central bank is. But I think our view, at least on it, is as I've said already, if we don't embrace it now, we will find elements of the market developing in a place that we can't reach it. And our policy objectives of ensuring settlement occurs in central bank money may be at threat.
Thank you.
When one visualizes a single payment platform, the immediate question that comes to mind is what would make an ideal base for it? Would it be the card company's model? It can be extended, or maybe advanced form of Target 2, or another level of GPI, or the DLT. So what do you think should be the starting point to provide a single platform, the base, the card companies? Kindly, your views, please.
Who would like to take that question?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I can try to say a few. I'm not sure I completely understood the question. I do not think none of us are thinking that there will be a single payment platform globally. But what at least I think on our side in Europe, we have the base to have a single environment to provide payment, which give a lot of synergies in the banking system, in the way the system is working, so that liquidity, cash, payments activity can go through a well-integrated infrastructure, efficient in central bank money, and well interacting with the market so that eventually commercial offer can develop on this strong basis. Then the point is how we interconnect with the others, and I guess I am not thinking possible to see today a global single payment platform at all, more an interaction. What was interesting, I think, is the GPI experience, which is trying to take the best out of it so that you know where you are when you have a cross-border experience, but
I think
it's not
GPI,
a single IT platform.
Right. I mean, I think GPI is certainly one opportunity. I think another is, as we mentioned, you've got 40 countries around the world who are either have live or developing real-time payment systems. The vast majority of them that are in development now are building against ISO 20022 standards. And there's already discussions underway of those real-time payment systems interoperating with one another. I think that's another opportunity. I mean, I think if you think about the developing world and the telecom-based banking systems such as M-Pesa, why can't real-time payment systems or national-based low-value systems interact with the telecom-based banking systems? And in fact, I'm finding out that within certain markets, they're already tied together in a way to help the developing world lift some of their unbanked out of poverty, which I think is an absolutely tremendous outcome of this. So I think it could develop in multiple ways. Maybe high value in one direction and low value in another. Who knows? I'd actually like not to see that distinction, but maybe that's how it develops initially.
And I know that there were a lot of hands raised in the audience, but we only have a couple of minutes left, and I really did want to give the panelists maybe 30 seconds for final thoughts. We call that sometimes in diversity discussions the elevator pitch. Mark, if I can start with you.
Well, I think to just rebound on the last question, one important point we didn't have time maybe to share enough is Target 2 will be multi-currency, the new version, as T2S is. We speak of Europe, EU, whether there will be other currencies on it. So it's a way to answer that it's a way to build, but it's specific to an economic region who wants to build together a single market. In this respect, I think it's important to see that what we are trying to achieve is to globally use the same standards, ISO 20022 based, and to have good interaction across the different regions in the world.
And Tony?
So I'll just reiterate kind of the message. I think, from my perspective, what our clients deserve is a global, real or near real-time payment experience with complete transparency as to payment status, transparency as to cost, as well as risk mitigation that they and we and our regulators would expect.
Thank you. Miguel.
Thanks. So risking being repetitive with what I have said throughout the presentation, I think that the relevant vision point is that people should just do their economic transactions regardless of how they do it. And it is our job as payment system provider to allow this to happen without the customer noticing, whether it is 20022, whether it is the payments initiative, whether it is whatever technological solution we can find for that. But we have to provide this system, and we don't have to pass the costs on the consumer so that they have to learn some complicated way of fulfilling their transactions.
Thank you. Andrew.
Let me take it back to trains, because that's where I began. So some of you know Harry Potter will know that there is something in Harry Potter called Platform 9 3/4, which is at King's Cross, as it happens, one of the three stations I mentioned at the beginning. And Platform 9 3/4 is invisible to what they call muggles in the book, which is you and me, human beings. And I guess that's been a theme of a number of us today, which is payments ultimately should utterly reliably deliver something people want, without them necessarily even being aware that it's there. You may know that there's one scene in Harry Potter where they try and gain access to 9 3/4, but for some reason the gate has been blocked. And people sometimes describe that as being, akin to the access standards for central bank access. And that's one of the things that in RTGS we're going to change. So there you go, Lisa. And we're 48 seconds over.
We are, but I want to thank each one of you. It actually has been an exciting journey and active dialogue throughout the entire process. Thank you for your time. So maybe not so much a single platform, but maybe an integrated, interoperable platform that we're going to work towards. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.